Hey guys, tonight we begin not with a philosopher or a conqueror, but with a plant that's been confusing, healing, and mildly annoying governments for thousands of years. Cannabis. We're diving deep into the smoky origins of humanity's relationship with getting high, a story that stretches back further than you might imagine, through ancient burial sites, sacred temples, and the very foundations of civilization itself. This isn't just about when people first lit up. It's about how a simple plant became woven into the fabric of human culture, religion, and consciousness across every continent and every age. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's smoky little history together. We're in roughly 5000 BC now, the Stone Age. Emphasis on stone. Civilization is still in beta testing. People are inventing pottery, domesticating animals, and dying of things like standing near a mosquito. Somewhere in what's now Siberia, a forager probably tossed cannabis onto a campfire for warmth, took a deep breath, and forgot why they went outside in the first place. Archaeologists later found cannabis seeds in ancient burial sites, which means someone valued this plant enough to take it to the grave, literally. Either it was a sacred ritual or a prehistoric version of "don't bury me without my stash." Given human nature, probably both. At first, cannabis wasn't about good vibes or philosophical musings. It was about survival. The fibers made ropes and clothes. The seeds were edible. And the plant was basically nature's Swiss Army knife. You could sail with it, tie things with it, wear it, and if you accidentally smoked it, suddenly find the clouds hilarious. Imagine being one of the first humans to inhale it on purpose. No one to explain what's happening. No snacks, no Bob Marley. Just raw confusion and a deep conversation with a tree that isn't talking back. Early humans probably didn't think they were getting high. They thought the gods had upgraded their vision. And yet, from that accidental puff, the legend began. A plant that would one day travel the globe, inspire poetry, trigger paranoia, and fund entire reggae albums. All starting with some bored Neolithic farmer who wanted to see what would happen if he set fire to his crops. So before the word weed even existed, cannabis had already outsmarted us. It found the one species dumb enough to cultivate it, worship it, outlaw it, and smoke it, often in the same century. Humanity, meet your oldest love-hate relationship. Fast forward to 2700 BCE, where China was inventing everything: paper, silk, bureaucracy, and apparently the world's first medical endorsement for getting high. Enter Emperor Shen Nung, known as the Divine Farmer, which sounds noble until you realize it means he spent most of his reign taste-testing random plants to see which ones killed him. The man was basically the world's first drug trial, with no control group. According to legend, Shen Nung discovered hundreds of herbs this way, including ginseng, tea, and yes, cannabis. His book, The Pen Sao Ching, reads like an ancient Yelp for plants. Good for pain, gout, rheumatism, and forgetfulness, which is impressive because cannabis probably caused the forgetfulness he was treating. To Shen Nung, weed wasn't a vice, it was medicine. The Chinese didn't roll it up or pass it around. They brewed it into tonics, ground it into powders, and probably called it something wise-sounding like wind in the bones elixir. It treated fevers, calmed nerves, and made people slightly too confident about their poetry. By this point, hemp was everywhere, spun into rope, woven into clothes, written on as paper. Entire towns were basically built out of cannabis. You could live your whole life surrounded by the same plant. Your clothes, your scrolls, your fishing nets, and if you were lucky, your mild painkiller. It was like living inside an eco-friendly bong. Doctors in ancient China took it seriously. They believed cannabis balanced the body's yin and yang, which is a polite way of saying it chills you out. It wasn't recreational yet. But let's be honest. Every civilization that says it's using something for spiritual healing usually ends up giggling at shadows. So, While the rest of the world was still inventing fire pits and bad decisions, China had already added cannabis to its pharmacy. Shen Nung might not have known what THC was, but he knew one thing. It made people stop complaining for a while. And in a world full of famine, floods, and Mongols warming up in the distance, that's what you'd call medical progress. While China was busy bottling cannabis into tonics and pretending it was strictly medicinal, their neighbors on the open grasslands of Central Asia had a simpler idea. Just burn it and breathe deeply. Meet the Scythians, the horse-riding nomads who basically lived outdoors, looked like they hadn't slept since birth, and had a collective attitude best described as armed and unbothered. Around 1000 BCE, these people decided that death rituals were missing something, mainly smoke, not incense, not sage, cannabis. Greek historian Herodotus wrote that the Scythians would throw hemp seeds onto hot stones inside sealed tents. Within minutes, the place filled with thick, aromatic clouds, and then, in his words, they would howl with pleasure, which is ancient Greek for someone's about to freestyle under the stars. This wasn't some small ritual puff either. They treated it like a full-body baptism in THC. Imagine 20 warriors, all covered in tattoos and fur, crawling into a tent with burning hemp and emerging spiritually reborn and slightly disoriented. The Scythians didn't have a word for relaxation, but this was probably the closest they got. The smoke wasn't just for fun. It was sacred. It helped them commune with the spirits of the dead, ease grief, and let's be honest, make the afterlife sound like a pretty good deal. Archaeologists later uncovered golden bongs. Yes, literal gold, buried in Scythian tombs, still coated with traces of cannabis residue. That's right. These ancient warriors died the way they lived, stylish, mysterious, and slightly high. You can't buy that kind of historical commitment. Other cultures eventually copied the idea. From Persia to India, nomads and mystics alike began inhaling cannabis smoke during funerals, festivals, and philosophical debates. Because if you're going to question the meaning of life, it helps if the air itself is giving you ideas. So, while the Chinese were boiling their medicine and writing about balance, the Scythians were perfecting the ancient art of the hot box. No fancy rituals, no incense, just fire, smoke, and an unspoken agreement. No one opens the tent flap until someone starts seeing gods. While the Scythians were hotboxing tents on the steppes, India decided to make cannabis holy. Because if you're going to inhale smoke and see visions, you might as well make it sound respectable. By around 1500 BCE, cannabis had made its grand debut in the Atharva Veda, one of the 4 sacred Hindu texts. It was listed as one of the 5 sacred plants, said to be a gift from the gods, specifically Shiva, who according to legend discovered it under a celestial tree, took a few hits, and promptly entered a state of divine chill. From that day forward, Shiva was known as the Lord of Bhang, which is arguably the coolest religious title in human history. Bhang, by the way, wasn't smoked. It was drunk. Imagine a smoothie made of milk, spices, crushed cannabis leaves, and the vague promise of enlightenment. Priests, yogis, and festival-goers would sip it during ceremonies, praise the gods, and then forget what they were praising halfway through. It wasn't considered rebellious. It wasn't illegal. It was sacred. In temples, cannabis was used to purify the spirit. In villages, it was used to tolerate your relatives. It was medicine, meditation, and mild escape, all in one convenient leaf. Festivals like Mahashivaratri became full-on divine parties where worshippers stayed up all night, singing hymns, dancing, and drinking bhang until they could practically see the universe vibrating. If enlightenment had a recipe, it was probably this: 1 part devotion, 1 part weed, and 1 unfortunate hangover the next morning. And while other civilizations treated cannabis as a ritual tool or trade good, India gave it a personality, playful, spiritual, and stubbornly human. It wasn't just a plant. It was a companion on the path to understanding the universe, or at least pretending to. The beauty of it all? No one pretended it was just for health. It was explicitly for joy, transcendence, and occasionally forgetting that you had 10 more years of drought ahead. So while the rest of the world was coughing on incense, India elevated cannabis to divine status. They didn't just smoke it, they deified it. Because here, getting high wasn't escapism. It was enlightenment, with better snacks. While India was joyfully toasting Shiva with Pong milkshakes, China was taking a more serious approach. Because in China, even enlightenment comes with documentation. By around 1000 BCE, cannabis had already made its way into Taoist ritual life, which was basically a mix of meditation, alchemy, and doing weird things in caves to become immortal. Taoist monks believed that burning cannabis incense helped them communicate with spirits and see the future, which, if you've ever tried it, probably looked amazing for the first 10 minutes and terrifying for the next 2 hours. In Taoist texts, cannabis was sometimes called the liberator of sin, which sounds uplifting until you realize it also made people wander into forests trying to hug clouds. Monks would burn it during meditations, claiming it helped them open the gates of perception. Translation: they got so high they could hear their own heartbeat in stereo. China's relationship with cannabis was complicated. It wasn't a party drug, it was a philosophical one. Taoists weren't interested in escaping reality. They were trying to merge with it, which is a fancy way of saying, let's get high enough to think the universe is our roommate. Still, the early Chinese were far too organized to let things get out of hand. Cannabis was carefully measured, mixed with other herbs, and written about in scrolls that probably smelled faintly of smoke and regret. You didn't just light up. You followed a procedure, meditated, and hoped not to levitate into a wall. Meanwhile, Confucians, those eternal killjoys, frowned upon anything that loosened the mind too much. The Taoists said cannabis expanded consciousness. The Confucians said it expanded laziness. It was the first recorded drug policy debate in history, and it ended the same way all of them do. Everyone pretending to agree, then doing whatever they want at home. Through it all, cannabis remained the quiet companion of China's mystics, burned in temples, studied by scholars, and probably blamed for at least one lost manuscript. The result? A civilization that managed to turn getting high into a moral, philosophical, and bureaucratic process. Only in China could you inhale the cosmos, but make sure you fill out the right form first. By now, cannabis had earned its place in human civilization. Not as a mystical herb or a shady vice, but as the overachieving plant no one could get rid of. You could smoke it, wear it, write on it, build with it, and probably eat it if times got bad. It was the Swiss Army knife of the ancient world, except instead of opening bottles, it opened minds, occasionally too far. In ancient China, hemp wasn't just useful, it was everywhere. Farmers grew it in massive fields, villagers spun it into thread, and scribes turned it into paper. The world's earliest texts were written on hemp, meaning human civilization was literally recorded on weed. Somewhere, a Taoist monk was probably inhaling the same plant another monk was writing, "Stop inhaling this on." The fibers were legendary, strong, durable, and resistant to decay. Hemp ropes held up fishing nets, tied together ships, and occasionally restrained the same people who got too philosophical after smoking the other half of the plant. Clothing made from hemp lasted longer than marriages and was only slightly less comfortable. It didn't stop there. Archaeologists have found ancient hemp sandals, bowstrings, and even armor padding, because nothing says battle-ready like a soldier dressed head to toe in cannabis. It's possible that somewhere out there, an army marched into war completely surrounded by hemp and had no idea they were fighting inside history's first all-natural dispensary. As the plant spread west along trade routes, it conquered new continents without lifting a leaf. The Persians made rope, the Egyptians brewed it into ointments, and the Greeks, naturally, argued about its moral implications over wine. Everyone used it, everyone needed it, and everyone pretended it wasn't slightly suspicious how cheerful their weavers looked all the time. Hemp had become the quiet empire builder. It didn't need swords or soldiers. It simply offered strength, flexibility, and a faintly herbal smell that lingered for centuries. While kings fought over gold, hemp just sat in the corner, waiting for humanity to remember it existed. And eventually they would. Not for rope, not for scrolls, but for smoke. The era of practical use was over. The age of recreational enlightenment was just beginning. By the time cannabis drifted into ancient Persia, it had already been medicine, rope, and incense. The Persians looked at this miraculous plant, and being Persians, decided it should probably teach them something about the universe. Because in this part of the world, even getting high came with a reading list. The Assyrians were the first to use it regularly, calling it kunubu, which sounds suspiciously like the word cannabis because it is. They burned it in temples, not for fun, but for divine insight, which is ancient priest code for we're about to smell colors. When it reached the Persians proper, cannabis quickly found a home among Zoroastrian mystics who already had fire altars, cosmic dualism, and existential dread. All they were missing was a good mood enhancer. They believed the smoke carried prayers to the heavens, which, to be fair, it did, along with a few brain cells. Then came the philosophers. Persia had no shortage of people who enjoyed sitting cross-legged and debating metaphysics until everyone forgot what the question was. Cannabis fit right in. It dulled pain, softened the edges of reality, and made long conversations about the nature of truth almost tolerable. Ancient accounts mention that some priests used it during rituals to free the mind from doubt. Modern translation: suddenly, everything makes perfect sense, but not everyone approved. As usual, the ruling class caught wind of the idea and panicked. If people could reach the divine without paying temple fees, society might collapse. So cannabis began its long career as a suspicious substance, respected in private, condemned in public, and still passed around behind the incense burner. Persian traders helped spread it further west along the Silk Road, where it picked up new names, new rituals, and a growing reputation for philosophical chaos. By the time it reached Greece, it wasn't just a plant anymore. It was a traveling idea, a portable enlightenment kit with no instructions. So yes, Persia made cannabis philosophical. They turned smoke into spirit, contemplation into a contact sport, and a plant into a debate partner. And like all great philosophical discussions, it ended the same way, with someone saying, "Wait, what were we talking about again?" By the time cannabis floated down the Nile, Egypt was already running on divine bureaucracy. The gods had jobs, the priests had paperwork, and everyone was building pyramids without proper labor laws. Into this mix came cannabis, a small mercy for a civilization that had been collectively overworked for 3,000 years. The Egyptians, being practical, didn't throw big smoke parties like the Scythians or drink bhang like the Indians. They used cannabis medically, which is to say they pretended it was medicine and then used it for absolutely everything. It appears in the Ebers Papyrus, a 3,500-year-old medical text that lists cannabis as a treatment for inflammation, glaucoma, menstrual pain, and, this is true, bad temper. That last one alone could have saved pharaohs from a few wars. The priests were the main gatekeepers of cannabis use. They mixed it into balms, oils, and incense for temple rituals. Picture a high priest waving a censer full of fragrant smoke while declaring it purely spiritual. Sure, and so is tequila. The idea was that the sweet scent would carry prayers to the gods and probably made everyone in the temple feel a little closer to them. Cannabis even made it to the afterlife. Traces of it have been found in mummy wrappings and burial chambers, which means someone thought, if I'm crossing into eternity, I'm bringing a joint. It's hard to blame them. Eternity sounds long, and the afterlife was rumored to involve farming again. Women also used it. Ancient Egyptian midwives prescribed cannabis to ease childbirth pain, which was brave, given there were no epidurals, just divine chanting and whatever herbs you could smuggle past the priest. You can almost hear the advice, "Breathe, my queen, and pass the oil." Even the nobility joined in. Pharaohs loved their luxury, and cannabis ointments were applied to relieve royal migraines, possibly caused by the crushing weight of the crown or the endless meetings about pyramid deadlines. In short, the Egyptians didn't just build monuments, they built coping mechanisms. Cannabis wasn't a rebellion, it was a survival tool. When your gods demand perfection, your climate demands sweat, and your workers keep collapsing in the sun, a little green plant starts to look like divine intervention. By the time cannabis reached ancient Greece, the locals had already perfected two national pastimes: arguing and drinking. Naturally, a plant that encouraged both introspection and mild chaos fit right in. The Greeks didn't invent cannabis use. They just intellectualized it, as they did with everything. To them, nothing was sacred until it had been debated, categorized, and turned into a symposium topic. And so began the philosophical relationship between weed and wisdom, or as Plato might have called it, the Republic of Chill. Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Dioscorides wrote about cannabis in their medical texts, praising its ability to treat inflammation, earaches, and pain of the inner self, which might be the first recorded diagnosis of existential dread. They weren't exactly rolling joints under the Acropolis, but it's safe to say the stuff was around and probably discussed in that overly serious tone that made everything sound profound. Imagine a symposium, a smoky hall, cups of wine, a half-dozen philosophers reclining on couches, and someone casually mentioning, "My friends, what if reality is an illusion?" Cue nodding, debate, and someone coughing in the corner because they took a little too much medicinal incense. The Greeks didn't see cannabis as scandalous. They saw it as natural. It grew in the wild, cured ailments, and occasionally caused the kind of clarity that ruins friendships. Soldiers used hemp to heal wounds, while thinkers likely used it to wound logic. Everyone had their angle. Even Herodotus, the travel blogger of the ancient world, wrote about the Scythians and their joyous vapors. The Greeks admired it, of course, but pretended to be above such behavior. You know, the way modern people admire yoga retreats but never go. It's not that Greek philosophers needed weed to think deeply. They already questioned everything: gods, laws, morality, and why sandals hurt so much. Cannabis just helped make those questions feel even more important. So while Athens debated the meaning of virtue, somewhere in a quiet garden, a lesser-known philosopher probably stared at an olive tree for 2 hours and whispered, "I think it understands me." And honestly, that's the most Greek thing that's ever happened. When the Roman Empire wasn't conquering people, it was busy conquering their stuff: food, gods, languages, and naturally, cannabis. The plant crept into Rome quietly, hitching a ride on trade routes and never leaving. The Romans didn't worship it like the Indians or philosophize about it like the Greeks. They just used it, complained about it, and wrote manuals on it. To a Roman, cannabis was practical. They used its fibers to make ropes, sails, and tents, essential gear for an empire that couldn't stop invading places. Hemp ropes hauled ships across the Mediterranean, tied prisoners, and occasionally doubled as laundry lines for togas soaked in regret. If Rome had a motto, it might have been Veni, Vidi, Vaped. Doctors loved it too. The famed physician Dioscorides, yes, the same Greek guy, Rome borrowed him like they borrowed everything, recommended cannabis for earaches, gout, and pain of the joints, which, to be fair, was probably half the population after years of marching, fighting, and public orgies. It also supposedly reduced sexual desire, the kind of prescription that instantly made it unpopular with the Senate. Meanwhile, Roman women used cannabis-infused oils for beauty treatments, claiming it softened the skin and eased female complaints. Given the quality of Roman plumbing and diet, that's probably the nicest thing their bodies experienced all year. But don't imagine marble statue stoners lounging around the forum. For Romans, intoxication was a moral issue. Wine was civilized, hashish suspicious. Anything that made you too happy without taxation was a problem. So while hemp was everywhere, actually smoking it was reserved for foreigners, mystics, and that one uncle who never shut up about the stars. Still, it spread through the empire like gossip at a bathhouse. Roman soldiers carried hemp seeds to distant provinces, unknowingly turning half of Europe into potential farmland for the world's most versatile weed. From Britain to North Africa, cannabis took root quietly, stubbornly, like every idea Rome tried to suppress. So while emperors toasted with wine and philosophers debated virtue, humble hemp was holding the empire together, literally. Sails, scrolls, ropes, and remedies, all courtesy of a plant no one wanted to admit they secretly respected. Rome may have fallen, but cannabis didn't. It simply waited, patient and green, for the next empire to take credit for discovering it. By the time the Silk Road hit its golden age, cannabis had achieved something every empire dreamed of: total globalization without a single battle. No armies, no conquests, just chill merchants spreading good vibes and better hemp. Picture it: a caravan winding through the deserts of Central Asia, camels groaning, traders sweating, spices perfuming the air, and somewhere in the back, a sack of cannabis seeds labeled "for medicinal purposes." It was the ancient world's version of a carry-on excuse. Along these routes, the plant became a shapeshifter. In China, it was medicine and paper. In India, it was sacred. In Persia, it was wisdom in smoke form. And by the time it reached the Middle East and Africa, it was hashish, portable, potent, and infinitely more fun than religion allowed. Merchants didn't just sell silk and spices, they sold culture. Every trade stop became a swap meet for ideas, stories, and the occasional cloud of aromatic smoke. You could hear Sanskrit hymns blending with Persian poetry, while someone in the corner accidentally invented hotboxing again. The assassins of Alamut, a secretive sect of hashish users in Persia, gained fame along the route. According to chroniclers, mostly biased, nervous Europeans, they smoked hashish before carrying out political assassinations. The truth is murkier. They probably just enjoyed the stuff and were good at stabbing. Still, the legend stuck, and Hashin eventually morphed into our modern word assassin, a linguistic masterpiece born from paranoia and bad PR. Further west, Arab physicians explored cannabis in medical texts, calling it both a cure for melancholy and a threat to discipline, which, frankly, still describes it perfectly. As for the traders themselves, they discovered an essential truth of business. People will always pay extra for anything that makes them forget they're on a camel for 9 months. The Silk Road turned cannabis into the first truly multicultural plant. It crossed languages, religions, and moral codes, and everyone pretended they were only using it for healing. Whether you were a monk in China, a merchant in Samarkand, or a mystic in Cairo, the smell was the same: smoke, dust, and mild enlightenment. Cannabis had gone viral, and there was no logging off. By the time the Islamic Golden Age rolled around, cannabis had become the polite guest nobody admitted to inviting, but everyone let stay. From Baghdad to Cairo, it wafted quietly through mosques, palaces, and poetry circles, never mentioned too loudly, but always there. The early Islamic world was a cultural powerhouse: algebra, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and a plant that made all of those things just a little more interesting. Scholars like Avicenna and Al-Razi wrote about cannabis in their medical works, describing it as useful for pain, digestion, and calming of the spirit, which is medieval code for take one and stop arguing about theology for 5 minutes. But Islam had a complicated relationship with intoxication. The Quran forbade alcohol, fair enough, but didn't say much about weed. That left room for interpretation, and wherever interpretation exists, humans immediately find a loophole. Thus, the rise of hashish, the original gray area of divine law. The Sufi mystics embraced it fully. These were the spiritual poets and dancers of Islam, the ones spinning in circles and claiming union with God through music, prayer, and occasionally substances that made God seem unusually chatty. For Sufis, cannabis wasn't a vice, it was a bridge, a fragrant, slightly giggly bridge to the divine. Meanwhile, the religious establishment frowned. Hashish dens popped up from Egypt to Persia, filled with scholars, merchants, and people who were definitely supposed to be somewhere else. Authorities called it a moral plague. Preachers condemned it as the herb of idleness. And yet, every crackdown failed, mostly because the enforcers also needed to confiscate large amounts of evidence for personal testing. By the 13th century, hashish had become the era's open secret. Poets praised it, rulers banned it, doctors prescribed it, and beggars smoked it. Everyone had an opinion, and half of them forgot what it was mid-sentence. So, while Europe was busy burning witches and bathing occasionally, the Islamic world was debating whether cannabis brought you closer to God or just closer to a nap. Either way, the result was the same: a civilization at the peak of its creativity and possibly a little high while getting there. Somewhere in the tangled mountains of 11th century Persia, cannabis got its first real PR problem. The legend begins with a secretive sect called the Nizari Ismailis, who built fortified castles, annoyed empires, and occasionally removed political rivals in creative ways. Their leader, Hassani Saba, ruled from a mountain fortress called Alamut, a name that roughly translates to eagle's nest, because murder headquarters didn't test well with the neighbors. According to medieval rumor, his followers, the Hashashin, smoked hashish before carrying out assassinations, moving in a blissful haze of divine purpose. Chroniclers swore that the drug made them fearless, devoted, and very stabby. It's an exciting story and almost certainly nonsense. In reality, there's no evidence these men ever used hashish before missions. The myth was probably cooked up by their enemies, who needed a good excuse for why an elite team of mountain zealots kept outsmarting entire empires. Blaming the drugs was easier than admitting the other side just had better planning. They're not geniuses. Their high became the medieval version of damage control, but the story spread faster than a rumor at a crusader camp. European knights returned home whispering tales of Eastern killers intoxicated by strange herbs. The word Hashashin mutated through languages until it became assassin. And just like that, a religion, a tactic, and a drug fused into one sensational headline that lasted 900 years. Ironically, the Nizari Ismailis were scholars, engineers, and diplomats more than anything else. They built libraries, negotiated treaties, and only killed people when absolutely necessary, which, admittedly, was still quite often. The idea that they got high before missions probably came from the same chroniclers who believed dragons lived in Ethiopia. Still, the damage was done. Hashish was forever linked with shadowy violence, even though the real connection was medieval gossip and a chronic lack of fact-checking. So, next time someone says assassin, remember, it started as an overblown rumor about a group of bookish Persians who may or may not have enjoyed herbal incense. The myth survived, the castles fell, and cannabis gained a new reputation, from sacred plant to suspicious substance, and humanity, as usual, learned absolutely nothing from it. By the time cannabis drifted into medieval Europe, the continent had already developed a refined system for handling new ideas. Fear them, ban them, then quietly use them anyway. Hemp had been around for centuries as rope, oil, and fabric. No one thought twice about it. But the moment someone decided to light it up instead of spin it, the church got involved. To be fair, medieval Europe wasn't exactly in a mood for experimentation. Between crusades, famines, and the occasional plague wiping out a third of the population, people were barely holding it together. The church controlled everything: law, medicine, and your odds of eternal happiness. And it wasn't thrilled about substances that made peasants giggle during sermons. Still, cannabis slipped through the cracks. Monks grew hemp in monastery gardens to make parchment and prayer ropes, all while writing moral condemnations of sinful herbs. It's safe to assume at least one monk tried the product and had a profound spiritual moment involving a candle flame and 37 Gregorian chants. By the 13th century, doctors and apothecaries were quietly prescribing cannabis oil for pain, fever, and what they delicately called female complaints. It worked, which made it suspicious. Anything that cured suffering without divine intervention raised eyebrows and usually torches. The church preferred its miracles to come from heaven, not from someone's backyard. Meanwhile, travelers returning from the Crusades brought stories of hashish dens in the East, dark rooms full of relaxed people who weren't killing each other. Naturally, Europe found this horrifying. Chroniclers described Saracens who smoke madness into their souls. Translation: they looked happy, which was clearly evil. Before long, cannabis joined the growing list of things the church disapproved of. Pagan rituals, heresy, women reading, and now good moods. Officially, it was labeled a devil's herb. Unofficially, it was still being used by midwives, herbalists, and anyone with chronic back pain and a realistic view of God's priorities. So Europe managed to take a versatile, harmless plant and turn it into a moral crisis, a skill it still hasn't lost. Hemp stayed legal as long as it behaved. But the moment it hinted at pleasure, it was excommunicated. Thus began Europe's longest-standing tradition, being both terrified of and dependent on the same thing. By the late Middle Ages, cannabis had done what most humans couldn't: survived everything. Empires rose and fell, languages changed, entire civilizations burned. And yet, the same scrappy green plant just kept growing wherever people were stressed and soil existed. Europe used hemp for everything: ropes, sails, paper, and clothing. The age of exploration was basically powered by weed, not the fun kind, but the kind that held up ships. Columbus wouldn't have made it to the New World without hemp rigging, hemp caulking, and probably hemp underwear. So, yes, in a way, cannabis accidentally discovered America. Still, its reputation remained divided. To the working class, it was a practical crop. To doctors, it was medicine. To the church, it was one more thing to blame for moral decay. Every group needed it, hated it, or both, which is more or less the story of civilization. By the Renaissance, scientists were dissecting everything from corpses to philosophy, and cannabis quietly snuck back into medicine cabinets. Apothecaries sold it for pain, seizures, and sleeplessness. Poets hinted at it in verse. And while Europe still officially frowned upon pleasure, it had also just invented gin, so judgment was a bit selective. Then came the colonial era, where cannabis sailed across oceans again, this time in every direction. The Spanish planted it in the Americas. The Portuguese took it to Africa. The British industrialized it. Every empire claimed it was introducing a useful agricultural resource, which is history's polite way of saying, we're cashing in. By the 19th century, cannabis had gone from sacred to scandalous to scientific. Victorians used it in tinctures for nerves, sleep, and hysteria, while politely ignoring that half their society was addicted to laudanum. Doctors praised it. Artists painted about it. Then, as always, governments panicked and outlawed it because nothing frightens authority like people being relaxed. And yet, here we are, thousands of years later, still debating the same plant, a plant that outlived pharaohs, philosophers, popes, and prohibition. It built ships, healed wounds, started myths, and occasionally made people stare at wallpaper for hours. Humanity keeps trying to control cannabis, but somehow it always slips through our fingers. One puff, one poem, one perfectly rolled piece of history at a time. The 19th century brought cannabis into the drawing rooms of Victorian society, wrapped in respectability and medical legitimacy. This was the era when proper ladies took laudanum for their nerves, and gentlemen smoked opium for their constitutions, all while maintaining the stiffest upper lips in human history. Cannabis fit right into this pharmaceutical free-for-all, marketed as a cure for everything from headaches to hysteria. The transformation began with an Irish physician named William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, who traveled to India in 1833 and discovered what locals had known for millennia: cannabis worked. He experimented with it on patients suffering from rheumatism, cholera, and tetanus, documenting its effects with the methodical precision of a man who'd found something remarkable. His research papers, published in British medical journals, introduced cannabis to Western medicine as a legitimate therapeutic agent. By 1850, cannabis appeared in the United States Pharmacopoeia for the first time, the official compendium of approved medicines. Doctors prescribed it in tincture form, a bitter-tasting liquid that patients took by the spoonful. It was available at any pharmacy, no questions asked, sitting on shelves next to aspirin and cough syrup. The irony is delicious. The same substance that would later spark moral panics and fill prisons was once as common as cold medicine. Victorian physicians praised cannabis for its versatility. It relieved pain without the addictive properties of opium. It calmed anxiety without the stupor of alcohol. It helped patients sleep without the dangerous side effects of chloral hydrate. Medical journals published case studies of successful treatments, and cannabis-based medicines became standard tools in the physician's arsenal. But this was also the era of moral reform movements, temperance crusades, and an obsession with social purity that would make a Puritan blush. The same society that embraced cannabis medicinally was simultaneously developing an anxiety about pleasure, intoxication, and anything that might corrupt the moral fiber of the nation. The seeds of prohibition were already being planted, even as cannabis sat respectably in medicine cabinets across America and Europe. Women, in particular, were frequent users of cannabis medicines. Victorian society expected them to suffer in silence, from menstrual pain, childbirth, and the general burden of being female in a male-dominated world. Cannabis offered relief without scandal, a socially acceptable way to manage the physical and emotional toll of 19th-century womanhood. Advertisements in ladies' magazines promoted cannabis remedies with the same enthusiasm as corsets and face powder. The plant had achieved something remarkable: mainstream acceptance. For a brief, shining moment in history, cannabis was neither sacred nor sinful. It was simply useful. But that moment wouldn't last. The 20th century was coming, and with it, a new kind of moral panic that would transform this respectable medicine into public enemy number one. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, cannabis was about to get caught up in something it had never faced before: racism, xenophobia, and the peculiar American talent for turning social problems into drug wars. The plant that had sailed with Columbus and soothed Victorian ladies was about to become a scapegoat for fears that had nothing to do with getting high. The Mexican Revolution of 1910 sent waves of refugees across the border into the United States, bringing with them their language, their culture, and their traditional use of cannabis, which they called marijuana. This wasn't the medicinal tinctures of American pharmacies. This was smoking the dried leaves and flowers, a practice that seemed foreign and threatening to Anglo-American sensibilities. Suddenly, the same plant that had been perfectly respectable when prescribed by doctors became dangerous when associated with Mexican immigrants. Newspapers began running sensational stories about marijuana madness, claiming the drug turned peaceful people into violent criminals. The fact that these stories were largely fabricated didn't matter. They fed into existing prejudices and provided a convenient excuse for anti-immigrant sentiment. The transformation was swift and deliberate. Cannabis sounded medical and scientific. Marijuana sounded foreign and scary. Politicians and law enforcement officials began using the Spanish name exclusively, knowing it would trigger xenophobic reactions. They weren't banning medicine. They were protecting America from a foreign menace. State after state began passing laws against marijuana, often with little debate or scientific evidence. The first was Massachusetts in 1911, followed by California in 1913. By the 1920s, most Western states had banned the plant, usually as part of broader anti-Mexican legislation. The laws were rarely enforced against white users, but came down hard on Mexican immigrants and other minorities. This was cannabis's first taste of prohibition, and it revealed something ugly about American society. The same substance could be medicine or menace depending on who was using it. When white doctors prescribed it, cannabis was therapeutic. When brown people smoked it, it was dangerous. The plant hadn't changed, but the politics around it had shifted dramatically. The irony was that most Americans had no idea what marijuana actually was. Many continued using cannabis medicines from their local pharmacy, completely unaware that they were consuming the same substance being demonized in newspapers. The disconnect between medical cannabis and criminal marijuana would persist for decades, a testament to the power of propaganda over science. By the 1930s, the stage was set for a national prohibition campaign that would make alcohol's ban look reasonable. Cannabis was about to face its greatest enemy yet, a federal bureaucrat named Harry Anslinger, who would turn a regional prejudice into a national obsession and transform a healing plant into America's most feared drug. Enter Harry Jacob Anslinger, a man whose name would become synonymous with cannabis prohibition and whose influence would shape drug policy for generations. Appointed as the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1930, Anslinger was a career bureaucrat with a talent for publicity and a genius for turning moral panic into political power. Anslinger faced a problem. His new agency needed a mission. Alcohol prohibition was ending, which meant the federal government's war on booze was winding down. But bureaucracies don't voluntarily shrink. They find new enemies to justify their existence. Cannabis, already banned in many states and associated with unpopular minorities, was the perfect target. The campaign Anslinger launched was a masterpiece of propaganda and fear-mongering. He collected every sensational story about marijuana he could find, most of them fabricated or grossly exaggerated, and fed them to newspapers across the country. His press releases described cannabis as a violence-causing drug that turned users into homicidal maniacs. He claimed it was more dangerous than heroin and cocaine combined. The stories Anslinger promoted were lurid and racist. He spoke of jazz musicians, code for Black Americans, corrupting white youth with marijuana. He described Mexican immigrants using the drug to seduce and assault white women. He claimed that cannabis gave users superhuman strength and made them immune to pain, requiring multiple bullets to stop them. None of this was true, but truth wasn't the point. Fear was. In 1936, the propaganda campaign reached its peak with the release of Reefer Madness, an exploitation film that depicted cannabis users as deranged killers and sexual predators. The movie was so over the top that it eventually became a comedy classic, but at the time, it was taken seriously by audiences who had no other source of information about the drug. Anslinger's masterstroke came in 1937 with the Marijuana Tax Act. Rather than banning cannabis outright, which might have faced constitutional challenges, the law imposed prohibitive taxes and regulations on its sale and possession. Technically, cannabis remained legal, but the bureaucratic requirements made it impossible to obtain legally. It was prohibition by paperwork, and it worked perfectly. The medical community barely protested. Most doctors had already moved on to newer synthetic drugs, and the American Medical Association's objections were muted and ineffective. The few physicians who spoke up were dismissed as cranks or addicts. Within a few years, cannabis had been completely removed from American medicine, erased from textbooks and pharmacies as if it had never existed. Anslinger's success was complete. He had transformed a plant used safely for thousands of years into America's most feared drug. He had built a federal bureaucracy dedicated to cannabis prohibition, and he had created a template for drug war propaganda that would be used for decades to come. The age of reefer madness had begun, and it would last for the next 80 years. While Harry Anslinger was busy demonizing cannabis in government offices and newspaper headlines, the plant was finding refuge in America's cultural underground. Jazz clubs in Harlem, bohemian enclaves in Greenwich Village, and the emerging counterculture movements of the 1940s and 50s became sanctuaries for a plant that had been driven from respectable society. Jazz musicians in particular embraced cannabis with an enthusiasm that terrified moral guardians like Anslinger. Louis Armstrong, Cab Calloway, and countless other performers found that cannabis enhanced their creativity and helped them cope with the brutal realities of being black entertainers in a segregated society. They developed their own slang for it, tea, gauge, muggles, and wrote songs that celebrated its effects in coded language that flew over the heads of white authorities. The relationship between jazz and cannabis was more than recreational. It was artistic and spiritual. Musicians claimed the drug helped them hear music differently, to improvise with greater freedom, and connect more deeply with their instruments. Whether this was pharmacologically true or simply a matter of belief, the cultural association between cannabis and creative expression was being forged in smoky clubs across America. The Beat generation of the 1950s took this underground tradition and made it literary. Writers like Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, and William Burroughs experimented with cannabis alongside other consciousness-altering substances, seeking new forms of artistic expression and spiritual insight. Their writings, while often cryptic about drug use, helped introduce cannabis to a generation of college students and intellectuals who were beginning to question conventional American values. But the underground came with a price. Cannabis users lived in constant fear of arrest, imprisonment, and social ostracism. A single joint could result in years in prison, the loss of employment, and permanent social stigma. The plant that had once been medicine became a marker of criminality, rebellion, and social deviance. The irony was that many of the people enforcing cannabis prohibition had no idea what they were fighting. Police officers, judges, and politicians had never seen the plant, never experienced its effects, and often confused it with far more dangerous substances. They were waging war against a myth, a propaganda creation that bore little resemblance to the mild intoxicant actually being used by musicians, writers, and artists. This disconnect between reality and rhetoric would persist for decades. While government officials spoke of cannabis as a dangerous narcotic that destroyed lives and corrupted youth, actual users knew it as a relatively harmless substance that enhanced creativity, promoted introspection, and provided a gentle escape from the pressures of modern life. The gap between official policy and lived experience was enormous, and it was growing wider every year. By the end of the 1950s, cannabis had been successfully driven underground, but it hadn't been eliminated. Instead, it had found a new identity as a symbol of artistic rebellion and cultural resistance. The stage was set for the next chapter in its long history, the explosion of the 1960s, when a generation of young Americans would rediscover the plant their grandparents had used as medicine and transform it into a symbol of social revolution. The 1960s didn't just change America, they changed everything, including humanity's relationship with cannabis. What had been a hidden vice of jazz musicians and beat poets suddenly became the sacrament of a generation determined to remake society from the ground up. The plant that Harry Anslinger had spent decades demonizing was about to become the symbol of everything the establishment feared: youth rebellion, social change, and the questioning of authority. The transformation began on college campuses, where students who had grown up on Anslinger's propaganda encountered cannabis for the first time and discovered that everything they'd been told was a lie. Instead of turning into homicidal maniacs, they found themselves laughing at the absurdity of their professors, questioning the Vietnam War, and wondering why a plant that made them feel peaceful and introspective was illegal while alcohol, which made people violent and stupid, was sold in every store. The counterculture that emerged around cannabis was unlike anything America had seen before. It wasn't just about getting high. It was about consciousness expansion, spiritual exploration, and the rejection of materialistic values. Cannabis became a tool for what users called turning on, not just to the drug's effects, but to new ways of thinking, feeling, and being in the world. The Summer of Love in 1967 marked cannabis's full emergence into mainstream consciousness. San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district became a pilgrimage site for young people seeking alternatives to conventional American life, and cannabis was the communion wine of this new religion. The plant that had once been associated with Mexican immigrants and black jazz musicians was now the drug of choice for middle-class white college students, a demographic shift that would eventually change everything. Music became cannabis's most powerful advocate. Bob Dylan, the Beatles, and countless other artists began incorporating drug references into their songs, normalizing cannabis use for millions of young listeners. When the Beatles admitted to using LSD and cannabis, it sent shockwaves through the establishment and made drug experimentation seem not just acceptable but cool. The same plant that had inspired jazz musicians was now soundtracking a cultural revolution. But the 60s cannabis culture was about more than music and rebellion. It was deeply intertwined with the anti-war movement, civil rights activism, and environmental consciousness. Users saw connections between the plant's illegality and other forms of social injustice. If the government was lying about cannabis, what else were they lying about? The credibility gap that opened around drug policy helped fuel broader skepticism about authority and institutions. The establishment's response was predictably hysterical. Politicians, police officials, and moral leaders warned of a generation being destroyed by drugs. They spoke of cannabis as a gateway drug that inevitably led to heroin addiction, despite mounting evidence that this wasn't true. The more they railed against cannabis, the more attractive it became to young people who were already questioning everything their elders told them. By the end of the decade, cannabis had achieved something unprecedented in its long history. It had become a mass phenomenon in American society. Millions of people were using it regularly, openly, and without shame. The plant that had been driven underground by prohibition was now at the center of the biggest cultural shift in American history. The war on cannabis was far from over, but the plant had won something more important than legal acceptance. It had won the hearts and minds of a generation. If the 1960s were cannabis's moment of triumph, the 1970s began with its greatest persecution. Richard Nixon, elected president in 1968 on a platform of law and order, looked at the counterculture movement and saw not just political opposition, but an existential threat to American values. Cannabis, as the symbol and sacrament of that movement, became enemy number one in what Nixon would call the war on drugs. Nixon's hatred of cannabis was personal and political. He associated the drug with everything he despised: anti-war protesters, civil rights activists, hippies, and intellectuals. In private recordings later released to the public, Nixon can be heard ranting about cannabis users as Jews, Negroes, and degenerates who were undermining American society. His drug war wasn't really about public health. It was about crushing political dissent and cultural rebellion. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 was Nixon's weapon of choice. The law classified drugs into 5 schedules based on their medical value and potential for abuse. Cannabis was placed in Schedule 1, the most restrictive category, alongside heroin and LSD. This classification meant that cannabis was considered to have no medical value and a high potential for abuse, a determination that flew in the face of thousands of years of medical use and growing scientific evidence of the plant's therapeutic benefits. The scheduling of cannabis was particularly cynical because Nixon's own commission, led by former Pennsylvania Governor Raymond Schaefer, had recommended decriminalization after conducting the most comprehensive study of cannabis ever undertaken by the federal government. The Schaefer Commission found that cannabis was relatively harmless, that its dangers had been greatly exaggerated, and that prohibition was causing more harm than the drug itself. Nixon ignored the report completely and buried it as deeply as possible. Instead, Nixon launched a massive escalation of drug enforcement. The newly created Drug Enforcement Administration received unprecedented funding and authority to pursue cannabis users and dealers. Penalties for cannabis offenses were increased dramatically, with some states imposing life sentences for possession of small amounts. The number of cannabis arrests skyrocketed from fewer than 200,000 per year in 1970 to over 400,000 by the end of the decade. The human cost of Nixon's war was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of Americans, mostly young and disproportionately Black and Hispanic, were arrested, prosecuted, and imprisoned for cannabis offenses. Families were destroyed, careers were ruined, and lives were shattered, all in service of a policy that even its architects knew was based on lies and prejudice. But Nixon's war had an unintended consequence. It made cannabis more popular than ever. The harsh penalties and hysterical rhetoric convinced many Americans that the government was overreacting, and the forbidden fruit became even more attractive. Cannabis use continued to rise throughout the 70s, spreading from college campuses to suburban living rooms, from counterculture enclaves to mainstream America. The plant that had survived thousands of years of human civilization was now facing its greatest test: a modern police state armed with helicopters, surveillance technology, and unlimited resources. But cannabis had something the drug warriors didn't expect: the loyalty of millions of Americans who knew from personal experience that their government was lying to them. The war on cannabis would continue for decades, but the plant's ultimate victory was already assured. If Nixon started the modern war on cannabis, Ronald Reagan turned it into a crusade. The former Hollywood actor brought a performer's flair for drama to drug policy, transforming what had been a law enforcement issue into a moral panic that would define American politics for a generation. Under Reagan, the war on drugs became total war, with cannabis users cast as enemies of civilization itself. Reagan's approach was shaped by his wife Nancy, whose Just Say No campaign became the public face of 80s drug policy. The campaign was brilliantly simple and completely divorced from reality. It treated all drugs as equally dangerous, ignored the complexities of addiction and mental health, and assumed that people used drugs simply because they hadn't been told not to. Cannabis, which millions of Americans used safely and responsibly, was lumped together with crack cocaine and heroin as part of a single, undifferentiated threat. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 was Reagan's legislative masterpiece, a law that dramatically increased penalties for drug offenses and created the modern system of mandatory minimum sentences. Under the new law, possession of small amounts of cannabis could result in years in federal prison, while distribution charges carried sentences that exceeded those for violent crimes. The law also created asset forfeiture provisions that allowed police to seize property suspected of being connected to drug crimes, even without a conviction. Reagan's drug war was also a technological war. The administration invested heavily in military-style equipment for police departments, turning local law enforcement into paramilitary organizations equipped with helicopters, armored vehicles, and automatic weapons. The Drug Enforcement Administration's budget increased by over 800% during Reagan's presidency, and the agency was given unprecedented authority to conduct surveillance, infiltrate organizations, and pursue suspects across international borders. The propaganda campaign that accompanied Reagan's escalation was sophisticated and relentless. The administration worked closely with Hollywood to produce anti-drug movies and television shows, funded school programs that taught children to fear and report drug use, and created public service announcements that portrayed cannabis users as losers, criminals, and threats to society. The famous "This is your brain on drugs" commercial, with its image of an egg frying in a pan, became an iconic symbol of the era's approach to drug education. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of Reagan's drug war was its racial dimension. While the administration publicly claimed to be fighting drugs in general, the enforcement was heavily skewed toward communities of color. African Americans and Hispanics were arrested, prosecuted, and imprisoned for cannabis offenses at rates far exceeding their proportion of the population or their actual usage rates. The drug war became a new form of Jim Crow, a way of controlling and marginalizing minority communities under the guise of public safety. The human toll of Reagan's escalation was staggering. The prison population exploded, growing from fewer than 500,000 in 1980 to over 1.2 million by the end of the decade. Most of the increase was due to drug offenses, particularly cannabis crimes. Entire communities were devastated as young men were removed from their families and neighborhoods, often for years at a time, for non-violent drug offenses. Yet even as the government spent billions of dollars and destroyed countless lives, cannabis use remained widespread. The plant that had survived persecution by pharaohs, popes, and emperors was proving equally resilient against modern American authoritarianism. The seeds of change were already being planted, even as Reagan's drug warriors celebrated their apparent victories. While politicians waged war on cannabis users, scientists were quietly rediscovering what ancient physicians had known for millennia. The plant was medicine. The 1980s and 90s saw an explosion of research into cannabis's therapeutic properties, driven partly by the AIDS epidemic and partly by advances in understanding how the drug actually worked in the human body. The breakthrough came in 1988, when researchers at St. Louis University discovered the first cannabinoid receptor in the human brain. This finding revolutionized understanding of how cannabis worked and suggested that humans had evolved specific biological systems designed to interact with the plant's compounds. The discovery of a second receptor in 1993, followed by the identification of the body's own cannabis-like chemicals called endocannabinoids, revealed that humans had an entire endocannabinoid system that regulated everything from pain and appetite to mood and memory. These scientific discoveries coincided with desperate medical need. AIDS patients were dying not just from the disease itself, but from the wasting syndrome that accompanied it, a devastating loss of appetite and weight that conventional medicine couldn't address. Cannabis, with its well-known ability to stimulate appetite and reduce nausea, offered hope where other treatments had failed. Patients began using it illegally, often with the quiet support of their physicians, and the results were undeniable. Cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy faced similar challenges. The nausea and vomiting caused by cancer treatments were so severe that many patients stopped treatment altogether, choosing death over the agony of conventional therapy. Cannabis provided relief that pharmaceutical anti-nausea drugs couldn't match, allowing patients to continue life-saving treatments while maintaining some quality of life. The medical marijuana movement began with individual acts of compassion and desperation. Patients grew their own plants, shared medicine with others in need, and formed underground networks that operated outside the law but within the bounds of human decency. Physicians, bound by their oath to, first, do no harm, began quietly recommending cannabis to patients who had exhausted other options. The government's response was characteristically harsh. Federal agents raided the homes of dying patients, arrested caregivers who provided medicine to the sick, and prosecuted physicians who dared to recommend cannabis. The spectacle of armed federal agents destroying the medicine gardens of AIDS and cancer patients became a powerful symbol of the drug war's moral bankruptcy. But the medical evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Study after study confirmed cannabis's therapeutic value for a wide range of conditions: chronic pain, epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, glaucoma, and dozens of others. The Institute of Medicine, the medical arm of the National Academy of Sciences, published a comprehensive report in 1999 that acknowledged cannabis's medical benefits while calling for more research and legal access for patients. The scientific renaissance of cannabis research revealed something that ancient healers had always known. This plant was a remarkably versatile medicine with a safety profile that exceeded most pharmaceutical drugs. The same substance that politicians had demonized as a dangerous narcotic was proving to be one of the safest and most effective treatments available for numerous medical conditions. The gap between scientific reality and government policy was becoming a chasm, and change was inevitable. The revolution began in California, as revolutions often do. In 1996, voters in the Golden State passed Proposition 215, the Compassionate Use Act, making California the first state to legalize medical marijuana since the federal prohibition began. It was a watershed moment that would reshape American drug policy and begin the long process of undoing nearly a century of cannabis prohibition. The campaign for Proposition 215 was driven by patients, not politicians. AIDS activists, cancer survivors, and chronic pain sufferers told their stories to voters, explaining how cannabis had saved their lives when conventional medicine had failed. The human face of medical marijuana proved more powerful than decades of government propaganda, and California voters responded with compassion and common sense. The victory was narrow but decisive. 56% of voters supported legalization, despite opposition from law enforcement, the medical establishment, and both major political parties. The result sent shockwaves through the drug policy establishment and inspired similar efforts in other states. Within a few years, Alaska, Oregon, Washington, Maine, Hawaii, and Nevada had all passed medical marijuana laws, creating a patchwork of legal cannabis in a country where federal prohibition remained absolute. The federal government's response was swift and harsh. The Clinton administration, despite its reputation for moderation, launched a campaign of intimidation against California's medical marijuana providers. Federal agents raided dispensaries, arrested patients and caregivers, and threatened physicians with the loss of their prescribing privileges. The message was clear: federal law trumped state law, and the drug war would continue regardless of what voters wanted. But something had changed in the American psyche. The sight of federal agents arresting wheelchair-bound patients and destroying medicine gardens created a powerful backlash against prohibition. Public opinion began to shift as Americans saw the human cost of the drug war and questioned whether cannabis was really the threat they had been told it was. California's medical marijuana industry grew despite federal harassment. Dispensaries opened in cities across the state, providing safe access to tested, regulated cannabis products. Patients who had been forced to buy from street dealers or grow their own plants could now obtain medicine in a professional medical setting. The sky didn't fall, crime didn't increase, and teenagers didn't suddenly start using cannabis in massive numbers. The success of California's medical marijuana program provided a template for other states and demonstrated that cannabis could be regulated like any other medicine. The plant that had been demonized as uncontrollably dangerous was proving to be remarkably manageable when treated with common sense rather than hysteria. More importantly, California's experiment began to normalize cannabis in American culture. Millions of people who had never considered using the plant began to see it as medicine rather than a dangerous drug. The stigma that had surrounded cannabis for decades began to erode as patients, physicians, and ordinary citizens shared their positive experiences with medical marijuana. The genie was out of the bottle, and no amount of federal enforcement could put it back. California had shown that cannabis prohibition was not inevitable, that states could chart their own course, and that voters were ready for a more rational approach to drug policy. The long journey back to sanity had begun, and there would be no turning back. California's breakthrough opened the floodgates. State after state began reconsidering cannabis prohibition, driven by a combination of medical necessity, fiscal reality, and changing public attitudes. What had seemed impossible just a few years earlier, the legal use of cannabis in America, was becoming inevitable as the domino effect of legalization spread across the country. The medical marijuana movement provided political cover for broader cannabis reform. Politicians who might have been reluctant to support drug legalization could support medical marijuana without appearing soft on crime. Patients made compelling advocates, and their stories of relief and healing resonated with voters who had personal experience with serious illness or chronic pain. By 2010, 14 states had legalized medical marijuana, each with its own regulatory framework and patient protections. Some states, like California, allowed broad access with minimal restrictions. Others, like New Jersey, created tightly controlled programs with limited qualifying conditions. But all represented cracks in the wall of prohibition that had seemed impregnable just a generation earlier. The Obama administration initially signaled a more tolerant approach to state marijuana laws, with Attorney General Eric Holder announcing that federal resources would not be used to prosecute patients and caregivers who were in compliance with state medical marijuana laws. The policy, known as the Ogden Memo, created space for state programs to flourish and encouraged more states to consider legalization. But the real breakthrough came in 2012, when Colorado and Washington became the first states to legalize cannabis for recreational use. The ballot initiatives in both states passed decisively, with voters rejecting decades of prohibition propaganda and embracing a regulated market for adult cannabis use. The plant that had been illegal for 75 years was suddenly legal again, at least in 2 states. The Colorado and Washington experiments were closely watched by the rest of the country and the world. Critics predicted disaster, increased youth usage, impaired driving, crime waves, and social collapse. Supporters hoped for tax revenue, reduced incarceration, and the elimination of a massive black market. The reality, as usual, was more mundane than either side predicted. Cannabis legalization in Colorado and Washington proceeded smoothly with well-regulated markets, declining youth usage rates, and significant tax revenue for state governments. The predicted disasters failed to materialize, while the benefits, reduced arrests, increased tax revenue, and improved public health outcomes, exceeded expectations. The success of these early experiments provided ammunition for legalization advocates in other states. The domino effect accelerated. Alaska, Oregon, and the District of Columbia legalized recreational cannabis in 2014. California, Massachusetts, Maine, and Nevada followed in 2016. By 2020, 15 states plus the District of Columbia had legalized recreational cannabis, while 36 states had medical marijuana programs. Each new state that legalized cannabis made prohibition seem more absurd and unsustainable. The patchwork of state laws created a complex legal landscape where cannabis could be legal in one state and a felony in the neighboring state, highlighting the arbitrary nature of prohibition and the need for federal reform. The state-by-state approach to cannabis legalization was messy, inconsistent, and sometimes contradictory. But it was also democratic, allowing different states to experiment with different approaches and learn from each other's successes and failures. The laboratory of democracy was working, and the results were clear. Cannabis prohibition was a failed policy whose time had passed. As cannabis emerged from the shadows of prohibition, scientists finally had the opportunity to study the plant systematically and understand how it actually worked in the human body. What they discovered was far more complex and fascinating than anyone had imagined. Cannabis wasn't just a simple intoxicant, but a sophisticated medicine that interacted with fundamental biological systems that regulated health and well-being. The key breakthrough was the discovery of the endocannabinoid system, a network of receptors, enzymes, and signaling molecules that existed in virtually every organ of the human body. This system, which scientists had been completely unaware of until the late 20th century, turned out to be one of the most important regulatory mechanisms in human physiology, controlling everything from pain perception and immune function to mood and memory. The endocannabinoid system worked like a biological thermostat, constantly adjusting and fine-tuning bodily functions to maintain optimal health. When the system was out of balance, due to injury, illness, stress, or genetic factors, cannabis compounds could help restore equilibrium by mimicking the body's own endocannabinoids or by modulating the system's activity. This discovery revolutionized understanding of why cannabis was effective for so many different medical conditions. The plant wasn't just treating symptoms, it was addressing underlying imbalances in one of the body's most fundamental regulatory systems. Chronic pain, epilepsy, anxiety, inflammation, and dozens of other conditions all involved dysfunction of the endocannabinoid system, which explained why cannabis could be therapeutic for such a wide range of ailments. Scientists also began to understand the complexity of the cannabis plant itself. Rather than containing a single active ingredient, cannabis produced over 100 different cannabinoids, each with its own effects and therapeutic potential. THC, the compound responsible for cannabis's psychoactive effects, was just one piece of a much larger puzzle that included CBD, CBG, CBN, and dozens of other compounds that work together in what researchers called the entourage effect. The entourage effect explained why whole plant cannabis was often more effective than isolated compounds. The various cannabinoids, terpenes, and other plant compounds worked synergistically, enhancing each other's benefits while minimizing side effects. This finding challenged the pharmaceutical industry's reductionist approach to drug development and suggested that nature had already created the perfect medicine in the form of the whole cannabis plant. Research also revealed that cannabis was remarkably safe compared to other drugs, both legal and illegal. Unlike alcohol, opioids, or even aspirin, cannabis had never caused a fatal overdose. The plant's safety profile was so good that it was virtually impossible to consume a lethal dose, even with concentrated extracts. This safety, combined with its therapeutic versatility, made cannabis an ideal medicine for many conditions. The science of cannabis also explained why the plant had been so important to human civilization for thousands of years. Humans had evolved alongside cannabis, developing biological systems that were perfectly designed to interact with the plant's compounds. The relationship between humans and cannabis wasn't accidental or aberrant. It was the result of millions of years of coevolution that had shaped both species. As prohibition crumbled and research expanded, scientists were rediscovering what ancient healers had always known. Cannabis was one of nature's most remarkable medicines, a plant that could heal the body, calm the mind, and enhance the human experience in ways that were only beginning to be understood. While America struggled with its cannabis prohibition, the rest of the world was watching, learning, and beginning to chart its own course toward more rational drug policies. The global cannabis reform movement drew inspiration from successful state-level experiments in the United States while adapting to local cultures, legal systems, and political realities. The Netherlands had been quietly tolerating cannabis use since the 1970s, when Dutch authorities decided to focus their enforcement efforts on hard drugs while allowing small-scale cannabis sales in licensed coffee shops. The Dutch approach wasn't full legalization. Cannabis remained technically illegal, but it was a pragmatic policy that separated cannabis from more dangerous drugs and reduced the harms associated with prohibition. The Dutch model proved that cannabis tolerance didn't lead to social collapse or increased crime. In fact, the Netherlands had lower rates of cannabis use than many countries with strict prohibition, particularly among young people. The coffee shop system also generated significant tax revenue and tourism income while reducing the power of criminal organizations involved in the cannabis trade. Portugal took a different but equally radical approach in 2001, decriminalizing all drugs and treating addiction as a public health issue rather than a criminal justice problem. The Portuguese model focused on treatment, harm reduction, and social reintegration rather than punishment and incarceration. The results were remarkable. Drug-related deaths, HIV infections, and crime all decreased dramatically, while treatment uptake and social functioning improved. Uruguay became the first country to fully legalize cannabis in 2013, creating a regulated market that allowed adults to purchase cannabis from licensed pharmacies, grow their own plants, or join cannabis clubs. The Uruguayan model was designed to undermine the illegal drug trade while protecting public health through regulation and education. Canada followed in 2018, becoming the first major industrialized nation to legalize recreational cannabis nationwide. The Canadian approach combined federal legalization with provincial regulation, allowing different provinces to experiment with different models while maintaining national standards for product safety and quality. Other countries began moving toward reform as well. Mexico's Supreme Court declared cannabis prohibition unconstitutional, paving the way for legalization. Germany announced plans to legalize recreational cannabis. Luxembourg, Malta, and several other European nations began developing their own legalization frameworks. The global trend toward cannabis reform was driven by the same factors that had motivated change in the United States: the failure of prohibition to reduce drug use or crime, the enormous costs of enforcement and incarceration, and growing recognition of cannabis's medical benefits. Countries that had blindly followed American drug policy for decades were beginning to question whether prohibition was serving their interests. International drug control treaties, which had been used to enforce global cannabis prohibition, began to seem outdated and counterproductive. Countries started withdrawing from these treaties or reinterpreting them to allow for domestic cannabis reform. The international consensus that had supported prohibition for nearly a century was crumbling. The global cannabis reform movement also benefited from changing attitudes among international organizations. The World Health Organization recommended rescheduling cannabis under international law, acknowledging its medical value and relatively low potential for abuse. The United Nations began discussing drug policy reform and harm reduction rather than simply demanding stricter enforcement. As more countries moved toward cannabis legalization, the remaining prohibitionist nations found themselves increasingly isolated. The plant that had been banned worldwide was becoming legal again, country by country, as governments recognized that prohibition had been a costly mistake that had caused more harm than the drug itself. As cannabis prohibition crumbled, a new phenomenon emerged: the corporate takeover of an industry that had been built by outlaws, activists, and small-scale entrepreneurs. Wall Street discovered cannabis, and suddenly the counterculture plant became the hottest investment opportunity in America. The green rush was on, and it would transform both the cannabis industry and the plant's cultural meaning. The transformation began with medical marijuana, as legitimate businesses sought to serve patients in states with legal programs. Early cannabis companies were often founded by activists and patients who had been involved in the underground medical marijuana movement. These pioneers faced enormous challenges: banking restrictions, federal legal uncertainty, and the stigma associated with a plant that remained federally illegal. But as more states legalized cannabis and the industry proved its viability, larger investors began to take notice. Venture capital firms, private equity funds, and even some public companies started investing in cannabis businesses. The industry that had been funded by cash and credit cards suddenly had access to professional investment capital. The corporate invasion accelerated after recreational legalization began in Colorado and Washington. Suddenly, cannabis wasn't just medicine, it was a consumer product with mass market potential. Companies that had been content to serve medical patients began dreaming of national brands, retail chains, and billion-dollar valuations. The influx of corporate money brought professionalization to an industry that had operated in the shadows for decades. Cannabis companies hired experienced executives from mainstream industries, implemented sophisticated marketing strategies, and developed products that appealed to mainstream consumers rather than just dedicated cannabis enthusiasts. But corporatization also brought concerns about the loss of cannabis culture and values. The plant that had been associated with counterculture rebellion, social justice, and community was being transformed into just another consumer product. Small-scale growers and entrepreneurs who had built the industry were being pushed out by well-funded corporations with access to capital and political influence. The corporate cannabis industry also struggled with the tension between profit maximization and social responsibility. Many companies paid lip service to social equity and criminal justice reform while pursuing business strategies that prioritized shareholder returns over community benefits. The plant that had been used to justify mass incarceration was now making some people very wealthy, while many of those who had been imprisoned for cannabis offenses remained locked up or burdened with criminal records. Some companies tried to address these concerns through social equity programs, expungement initiatives, and partnerships with communities that had been harmed by prohibition. But critics argued that these efforts were insufficient compared to the scale of the injustice that had been perpetrated in the name of cannabis prohibition. The corporate takeover of cannabis also raised questions about product safety, quality, and accessibility. While professional companies brought better testing, standardization, and quality control to cannabis products, they also brought higher prices and a focus on premium products that might not be accessible to all patients and consumers. Despite these concerns, the corporate cannabis industry continued to grow rapidly. By 2020, legal cannabis sales in the United States exceeded $15 billion annually, with projections suggesting the market could reach $50 billion within a decade. The plant that had been worthless under prohibition was becoming one of the fastest-growing industries in America. The green rush represented both the triumph and the tragedy of cannabis legalization. The plant was finally legal and accessible, but it was also being commodified and commercialized in ways that threatened to strip away its cultural significance and social justice potential. The challenge for the cannabis movement was to ensure that legalization benefited everyone, not just wealthy investors and corporate executives. As cannabis legalization spread across America, an uncomfortable truth became impossible to ignore. While some people were getting rich from legal cannabis, millions of others remained imprisoned or burdened with criminal records for doing exactly the same thing. The plant that was generating billions in tax revenue and creating thousands of jobs had also been the justification for one of the most destructive social policies in American history. The statistics were staggering and shameful. Over the previous 4 decades, more than 20 million Americans had been arrested for cannabis offenses. The vast majority of these arrests were for simple possession, people who were using cannabis for the same reasons that legal consumers used it today. The human cost was incalculable. Families destroyed, careers ruined, communities devastated, and lives forever altered by criminal records for a plant that was now legal in many states. The racial disparities in cannabis enforcement were particularly egregious. Despite similar usage rates across racial groups, Black Americans were nearly 4 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis offenses than white Americans. In some states, the disparity was even greater, with Black Americans being arrested at rates 8 or 10 times higher than whites. The war on cannabis had been, in practice, a war on communities of color. These disparities weren't accidental. They were the predictable result of policies that had been designed with racial bias from the beginning. From Harry Anslinger's racist propaganda in the 1930s to the targeted enforcement in minority communities during the crack epidemic, cannabis prohibition had always been about social control as much as drug control. As states moved toward legalization, advocates demanded that reform include provisions for social equity and restorative justice. They argued that the communities that had been most harmed by prohibition should benefit most from legalization, and that people who had been criminalized for cannabis should have their records cleared and be given opportunities to participate in the legal industry. Some states responded with social equity programs that reserved licenses for people from communities that had been disproportionately impacted by prohibition, provided funding and technical assistance for minority-owned cannabis businesses, and created pathways for people with cannabis convictions to enter the legal industry. California, New York, and several other states also implemented automatic expungement programs that cleared hundreds of thousands of old cannabis convictions. But progress was slow and uneven. Many social equity programs were underfunded, poorly designed, or undermined by political opposition. Large corporations with access to capital and political influence often found ways to circumvent social equity requirements, while the people these programs were supposed to help struggled to navigate complex regulatory systems and compete with well-funded competitors. The expungement process was also complicated and incomplete. While some states automatically cleared old cannabis convictions, others required individuals to petition for relief, creating barriers that prevented many people from accessing the benefits of reform. Federal cannabis convictions remained untouched, and people with cannabis records continued to face discrimination in employment, housing, and education. The social justice reckoning also highlighted the ongoing human cost of federal prohibition. While states were legalizing cannabis and clearing old convictions, federal authorities continued to prosecute cannabis offenses and maintain the plant's Schedule I classification. Thousands of people remained in federal prison for cannabis offenses that were now legal in their home states. The cannabis reform movement increasingly recognized that legalization without justice was incomplete. The plant that had been used to justify mass incarceration needed to become a tool for mass liberation, helping to repair the damage that had been done to individuals and communities over decades of failed prohibition. This recognition led to a broader conversation about drug policy reform, criminal justice, and racial equity. Cannabis legalization became part of a larger movement for social justice that challenged not just drug prohibition but the entire system of mass incarceration that had grown up around it. As we reach the end of our journey through the ancient origins of getting high, it's worth reflecting on how far we've come and where we might be heading. The plant that began its relationship with humanity in prehistoric burial sites has survived pharaohs and popes, emperors and prohibitionists, to emerge in the 21st century as both medicine and sacrament, commodity and catalyst for social change. The story of cannabis is ultimately the story of humanity itself, our endless quest for healing, transcendence, and connection to something greater than ourselves. From the Scythian warriors hotboxing their funeral tents to the modern cancer patient finding relief in a dispensary, the human relationship with cannabis has remained remarkably consistent across cultures and centuries. We seek the same things our ancestors sought: relief from pain, expansion of consciousness, and a brief respite from the challenges of existence. But the future of cannabis is being written in real time, and the next chapters remain unwritten. Federal legalization in the United States seems inevitable, but the details matter enormously. Will legalization prioritize corporate profits or social justice? Will it preserve the plant's cultural significance or reduce it to just another consumer product? Will it repair the damage done by prohibition or simply move on without addressing past injustices? The international cannabis reform movement is also at a crossroads. As more countries move toward legalization, they have the opportunity to learn from both the successes and failures of early adopters. They can design systems that prioritize public health over corporate profits, social equity over market efficiency, and human rights over political expediency. The medical potential of cannabis is still being discovered. As research restrictions are lifted and funding increases, scientists are uncovering new therapeutic applications and developing more sophisticated cannabis-based medicines. The plant that ancient physicians used to treat pain of the inner self may hold keys to treating depression, PTSD, neurodegenerative diseases, and conditions we haven't even identified yet. The cultural impact of cannabis legalization is also still unfolding. As the stigma associated with cannabis use continues to erode, the plant is being integrated into mainstream culture in ways that would have been unimaginable just a generation ago. Cannabis yoga classes, cooking shows, and lifestyle brands are normalizing the plant and introducing it to new audiences who might never have considered using it during Prohibition. But perhaps the most important lesson from cannabis's long history is that Prohibition was an aberration, not the natural state of affairs. For most of human history, cannabis was simply part of the pharmacopoeia used by physicians and patients, shamans and seekers, without moral panic or criminal penalties. The 20th century's war on cannabis was a historical anomaly driven by racism, politics, and propaganda, rather than science or public health. As we move forward, we have the opportunity to return to a more rational relationship with cannabis, one based on evidence rather than ideology, compassion rather than punishment, and respect for individual autonomy rather than authoritarian control. The plant that has accompanied humanity for thousands of years deserves better than prohibition, and so do the people who use it. The ancient origins of getting high remind us that the human desire for altered consciousness is not a modern pathology, but a fundamental aspect of our species. We have always sought ways to transcend the ordinary, to touch the divine, to heal our bodies and expand our minds. Cannabis has been our companion on this journey for millennia, and it will continue to be so for millennia to come. The story of cannabis is far from over. In fact, in many ways, it's just beginning. As prohibition crumbles and the plant emerges from the shadows, we have the chance to write a new chapter, one that honors both the ancient wisdom of our ancestors and the scientific knowledge of our time. The future of getting high is bright, and cannabis will be there to light the way. So tonight, as we conclude this journey through the smoky corridors of history, remember that you are part of this story. Every person who has ever found relief in cannabis, every advocate who has fought for reform, every researcher who has studied the plant, and every voter who has supported legalization is continuing a tradition that stretches back to the very dawn of human civilization. The plant that began in ancient burial sites has survived everything history could throw at it. It has outlasted empires, religions, and prohibition movements. It has adapted to every culture, climate, and legal system, and it will continue to evolve alongside humanity, offering healing, insight, and connection to all who seek it. The ancient origins of getting high are also the eternal origins of getting high. The same plant, the same human needs, the same search for something beyond the ordinary. Cannabis has been our teacher, our medicine, and our companion for thousands of years. And if we're wise enough to learn from both its history and our mistakes, it will continue to serve us for thousands more. The story continues, and you are part of it. The future of cannabis is in our hands, and the possibilities are as limitless as human imagination itself. From the first accidental high in a prehistoric cave to the dispensaries and research labs of today, cannabis has been humanity's faithful companion on the long journey toward understanding, healing, and transcendence. And that, my friends, is the true ancient origin of getting high. Not just the discovery of a plant, but the discovery of our own infinite capacity for growth, healing, and connection to the cosmos. The journey continues, and cannabis will be there every step of the way, just as it always has been.